So it is a really special pleasure for me to be with you on this 35th anniversary. I was delighted to have the invitation, and it is wonderful to be able to help you celebrate. I have really good memories of meetings in Belleville back in 1979, 1980, and especially the energy and vision of those people in this community in relation to the establishment of the clinic in Belleville. I may be the only person in the room who was involved in 1980, but it seems to me that the particular energy and vision in Belleville was quite special. And when I look at what has been accomplished and what the plans are, it's very clear that nothing has changed. You are still one of the leading clinics in Ontario. What I'm just going to do, and I hope not to take a huge amount of time, is basically do two brief things. Basically looking back at community legal clinics and going back to the 70s and at the time when Belleville was established in 1980. And then looking a little bit to the ways in which that history, I think, needs in fact to be continued as you move forward into the future. So I'm going to do a little bit of history and then basically talk about how I think that history informs the mission that community legal clinics in Ontario continue to have going forward into the future. Some of you will have this little sort of yellow sheet on your seats, and partly because I didn't want to bore you with a huge amount of the history, I thought I'd write some of it out for you. So it's there. I'm not going to really refer to it, but for those of you who are interested, you may in fact find it helpful. So the basic point here, I think, is that in terms of thinking about the future, the history of community legal clinics in Ontario is really fundamental to the mission, fundamental to the goals, and fundamental, I think, also to how much has been accomplished. The basic principle, I think, is that I see community legal clinics as basically one of our bottom-up social services as opposed to a top-down proposal. Legal aid services started in Ontario back in 1966 with a piece of provincial legislation that essentially established a centralized head office in Toronto and local application offices around the province. But the legal services that were available were essentially modeled on the services that would be provided to paying clients, mainly criminal law and family law services. And private practice lawyers provided those services using legal aid certificates and then were paid by the head office in Toronto. One of the things that is really fascinating in retrospect is that when the legal aid plan was initially established in 1966, there was no cap on the amount of funding for legal aid services. And so anyone who was eligible in terms of their income and in accordance with the statute would in fact receive the services. But if you think about that approach, it clearly is a centralized top-down kind of approach. And I think probably it wasn't very long before some community activists, some idealistic law students, and a number of lawyers decided that in fact they needed to envisage legal aid services for the most vulnerable, marginalized, disadvantaged people and communities in a quite different way. And this is very much the idea of the bottom-up approach. For example, they said that legal services were not just services, but that the provision of legal services should be used to create empowerment for individuals and communities. That the legal services needed to address the kinds of legal problems experienced by marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And of course, that meant they'd be quite different from those of paying clients. Probably one of the most interesting developments was that the people who were involved in the original clinics thought that communities themselves should be involved in defining the priorities for services, with community-elected boards of directors to provide the voices of that community in terms of service designs. Now, what's interesting about this is that these idealistic activists and students and lawyers decided, in fact, to establish community legal clinics completely outside the statutory framework of the Legal Aid Act of 1966. They got funding from a variety of governmental, social service, and university sources. But as a result, they established their own principles, their own delivery methods, and their own governance arrangements. And of course, they always had finite resources. So the boards of directors were really fundamentally important from the very beginning in helping to define what are the priorities for the services in this community. Some parts of the handout sort of give you a flavor, I think, of some of the debate that went on in the 1970s between the formal statutory legal aid services under the Legal Aid Act, and on the other hand, these upstart, often rather radical groups of people who seem to be providing legal services in completely different and I think unanticipated ways. And so this debate went on between the sort of formal statutory top-down arrangement, the legal aid certificate system, and the bottom-up community legal clinic system. Indeed, the debate got so raucous that there were actually 2 commissions of inquiry in the 1970s to think about what to do about these clinics. One was the Osler Commission in 1974, which was the first time that someone in a position of authority said, community legal clinics are a better way of delivering the kinds of services that are needed by the most marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And so as a result of that, community legal clinics began for the first time to be funded by the legal aid system itself. But of course, here we had these very independent and very different form of legal services being provided by community clinics by contrast with what was happening under the statute. And so only 4 years later, in 1978, the Grange Commission had to establish the funding principles for community legal clinics. There was, in fact, a more recent, although not really recent, review of legal aid, the McCamus Review in 1997, and it's on the handout as well. And it essentially endorsed the community clinic and its board of directors as the appropriate approach. So that over this period of time, we have seen community legal clinics folded into the Ontario legal aid system. When it happened that the Grange Commission decided on funding principles and so on, Legal Aid at the time actually set up a special unit within the Legal Aid office called the Clinic Funding Unit, and I was its original manager beginning in 1979. At the time, I think all the stars got aligned because Roy McMurtry was the Attorney General and was passionately supportive of community legal clinics. And as they say these days, the money flowed for the expansion of community clinics outside basically the Toronto area. There were a few in other parts of the province, but it was really during the period that I was clinic funding manager that the expansion throughout the province began, including here in Belleville in 1980. So let me now turn to thinking about that history and how it helps to continue to define the mission and goals of community legal clinics. I want to talk briefly about the 3 basic principles that I think that history illustrates. First of all, it very much illustrates how to deliver legal aid services for marginalized communities. In one of the background studies for the McCamus Review in 1997, my colleague Janet Mosier, who has for many years been involved with the clinic in Toronto, Parkdale Community Legal Services, did a really good study of all the different and multifaceted and integrated and complicated kinds of problems in law that marginalized communities have, and how it goes way beyond simply the issue of low incomes. She said that it was necessary for clinics to use their resources to meet not just the needs of individuals, but also groups within communities, and to develop specialized legal expertise and creative methods of delivering services. And you can sort of hear in the presentation that Deidre and Michelle gave that they're talking about how to be creative in the delivery of those services. The fundamental message here, though, in relation to legal services for marginalized communities is that the goal is not just access, but actually justice, right? The concept of access to justice, I think, too often focuses on ideas of access and not nearly often enough on the concept of justice. The second principle is that there has to be community involvement in decisions about priorities for delivering justice to these communities. Unfortunately, but frankly, realistically, effective use of scarce legal resources has always been a feature of community legal clinics. And community legal clinics have always involved their communities in decision-making about their priorities. I want to acknowledge very, very sincerely, being on a community clinic board is hard work. Making decisions about priorities in the context of scarce legal resources really presents hard challenges. But these tasks are fundamental for the mission of community legal clinics because they result in promoting the mission of community building. That is, community legal clinics are not just legal service centers, although of course they provide a great deal of service to their communities. But they're also partners with their communities, engaged in creative joint decision-making to promote community building and empowerment to both individuals and the broader communities. The mission of community building through the impact of community boards of directors was recognized in the Grange Report back in 1978. And there's sort of two interesting parts of that report. One part of the report identified how people who are marginalized as individuals or who are members of disadvantaged communities most often encounter law and lawyers as opponents of their interests. They're accused persons in criminal cases, they're tenants trying to avoid eviction, they're defendants in debt collection or consumer matters, or the recipients of bureaucratic decisions about social assistance, ODSP, employment insurance, workers' comp, etc. For these persons, the Grange Report articulated the mission of clinics this way, and this is a quote from the report. If there are to be effective services to the poor, the traditional distrust felt by the poor towards lawyers, the legal profession, and even toward the law itself must be reduced. To the extent that these communities have now placed their confidence in the community legal clinics, much of the credit must go to the strong role played in their development and operation by boards of directors. If clinics are to develop and progress with the continuing confidence of clients, that role must not be eroded. The boards must continue to govern the affairs of clinics, both as to policy and administration. In this context, if the mission is justice, It can only be achieved with the active involvement of communities and their community boards of directors. They are the voices of their communities, and they have to be strong voices, articulating the bottom-up needs of their community. And then let me turn finally to the third principle. This one I call systemic legal action to promote social inclusion, what I talked about as the community building mission. The history of community legal clinics and their origins with scarce legal resources emphasized creativity in delivering legal services to marginalized communities. Thus, rather than just focus on one-by-one services to individual clients, community legal clinics often engaged in systemic legal actions to address the underlying causes of legal problems, the problems that are shared by many people within a community. This includes lobbying politicians, test case litigation, group actions, and assistance with community negotiations. That kind of systemic legal action has more recently embraced a new language of social inclusion. What does a social inclusion approach mean? Well, first, it means an approach that focuses on the systems and practices that create poverty, exclusion, and inequality, and how to change those systems and practices. In a legal aid context, a social inclusion approach moves away from defining problems in terms of legal categories for services to focus on changing social and legal arrangements that create and perpetuate problems of exclusion. I know that language is a little bit not concrete, so let me try to be more concrete. The social inclusion approach tries to encourage its clients to feel that they are citizens with opportunities to participate in their communities, not just consumers who are the recipients of legal handouts. A second aspect of social inclusion is the empowerment of individuals and community building. And of course, it's in this context that community boards of directors remain absolutely vital. And finally, a social inclusion approach creates new ways of understanding community. That is, instead of just thinking about communities as geographical spaces, we often need to also identify communities as social relationships, a search for belonging in our society, and how we identify with many different communities based on our personal and family identities, our individual interests and needs, and our aspirations for our city, our province, and our country. In thinking about social inclusion and the future of this community clinic, here's some questions. How can we reimagine relationships between clinics and their communities in ways that encourage community building? How can we use community legal clinic resources to create meaningful opportunities for existing and potential clients and to promote their roles as citizens, not just consumers? And how can we use scarce resources to foster transformations that result in justice in addition to access? In conclusion, let me say that I think in defining the future, the past history remains fundamentally relevant. The need for community legal clinics to engage with the most marginalized individuals and communities to promote justice. The role of boards of directors in articulating the voices of marginalized individuals and communities, and the creation of new approaches to encourage social inclusion. All of us, citizens, and not just consumers. In its unbelievably excellent work for the past 35 years and its continued acceptance of these challenges, this community legal clinic is part of an extraordinary accomplishment in Ontario, one that is in fact envied the world over. It's a blessing for me to be here to celebrate with you and to wish you ongoing success in the next 35 years. Thanks very much.